1, 2, 3. Are we ready?
1, 2, 3. Is this one also ready?
Well, dear friends and colleagues, it's time for us to start our session on religious cultural heritage and sustainable development. This has gradually emerged into a standing theme in a lot of our meetings. Some people are rather perplexed. Why do we talk about cultural heritage and development? What do they have in common? Some begin to wonder, is there such thing as religious cultural heritage? And a lot of those questions are very valid, very appropriate. We have approached them in a holistic fashion. We have essentially cast a term, religious cultural heritage, to reflect all this complex interplay between places and movements, spiritual practices, rituals, pilgrimages, and have tried to identify the blind spots where a particular building, particular physical monuments are also a very important religious sites with living communities, which are stakeholders about the ways, defining the ways a particular site's identity is defined, beyond UNESCO lists, beyond state-owned or state-driven approaches to cultural heritage. And we have started unpacking series of blind spots which have not necessarily been captured by the existing legal instruments which deal with cultural heritage, which are often very specialized. They separate tangible and intangible cultural heritage and do not necessarily capture this more holistic and idiosyncratic dynamics between places, people living there, the public as a whole, which visit those places either for religious tourism or general tourism. And we started looking into how this emerging new category of cultural heritage relates to some of the challenges of sustainable development. To what extent places and faith-based actors associated with those places are agents for change. What kind of change they're agents of? Anything from environmental protection to building inclusive, dialogical, civic spaces which change the makeup of a particular city or even of a particular country. When a particular site which is a religious cultural heritage gets weaponized either by governments or by non-government actors in order to accelerate civic tensions, ethnic tensions, or any other emerging regional tensions, what should governments do about this? How could they develop their metrics in terms of policy making to prevent that and to really use the challenges shared or contested religious sites present in order to turn things around and turn the challenges into an opportunity and turn places which are symbols of division into places which become dialogical, inclusive, and make all stakeholders to feel as essentially co-participants in what could be considered either public reason and to share those places as common objects of love. And how a lot of those questions, in many ways and in different settings, are going to accelerate potentially some of the sustainable development goals which are part of the G20 agenda. Sadly, our session is clashing with the environmental session, and one of the most important stock-taking from the multiple dialogues we have participated in the past has been how connected the environment is with the protection of religious sites. Not because some religious sites are also natural sites and are protected as cultural objects, but because through our work we started looking into environment as ecosystems which are interconnected, and that our concern for the global warming and the physical environment is also relating to concern for civil and political rights, and how fragmentation of one type of ecosystem has a knock-on effect on multiple ecosystems, and how in turn nudging governments to take cultural heritage and religious cultural heritage in particular is a way to address this multiple mosaic of challenges of fragmented ecosystems. We have a stellar panel of friends and colleagues, as well as new friends and colleagues. There is an old miniature from Fatih Sikri, which represents a mighty Mughal emperor sitting in his interfaith council with Buddhists, Christian, Jesuit priests, Hindus, Jains, you name it. When we started this panel, it was rather thin, and gradually it began to emerge almost into as inclusive group as the Mughal Interfaith Council. We haven't been fully inclusive, but we're bringing different perspectives from different contexts where people have worked very hard on religious cultural heritage. Father Regent, he's a Catholic priest and he's based here in India, has done his PhD on legal protection of religious sites. We met in Oxford many years ago when he was still a student, and I was delighted that we managed to reconnect for this event. Father Regent, you obviously have written about this, but you're also engaging in the trench warfare as we speak. You run a legal aid clinic on the ground, and you could see in an Indian context what are the emerging challenges in terms of protection of religious sites, and how the Indian context speaks volumes in terms of comparative perspectives and global context. What is your take on that? What has changed and what has remained the same from the time you did your PhD?
Okay, thanks, Peter, and esteemed panelists, my colleagues. Very good afternoon. Well, it's a very interesting question you have raised. Like India, which is, geographically now it is one nation, but actually it has hundreds of cultures. Very, very plural natured country, actually, India. Religious wise, we are so blessed land. We have our own religions, and almost all the religions existed outside India are part of our culture now. This, when we say that cultural heritage, that in a fast changing world, that gives a kind of continuity for the humanity. That's very important. So when I was doing my research on Ayodhya dispute, it started actually in 1950, but almost for 40 years till it was entirely destroyed in 1992. The case was going on in the judiciary. The governments, they were not really interested to settle the issue because that will bring a lot of enmity between religious communities. That was their fear. So they allowed to persist. Cultural heritage as such, it really Ayodhya stands a kind of exceptional issue in our independent India. We have plenty of things to claim as heritage, tangible and both intangible. Take yoga, arts, music, dance, several forms. But mostly our communities are built around religion. Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Baha'i, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, and of course, plenty of indigenous people custom. So the sacred sites, India itself is considered as a sacred site for the inhabitants of 1.4 billion people. They call it Punya Bhumi. That means it is a real sacred land. And we have a very long history, of course. We have a very ancient civilization where the cultural heritage plays a very, very vital role. But recently, there is sort of mobilizing people around religious name, and the enmity sometimes built around the sacred sites. That's very sad, but still I would love that India is a very beautiful country. We love peaceful coexistence, and we have a wonderful constitution which declares India as a sovereign, secular, socialist, democratic republic. So that gives every citizen to have a very peaceful coexistence. It's a fundamental right. But since there are plenty of plurality existing already, there are certain minimal misunderstandings among the communities where the faith communities play a very vital role, bring peace and harmony. So we are now involved in peace building measures. For the political reasons, there are here and there some bad examples happening, but still there are plenty of efforts to promote harmony in this country, in and around the sacred sites. That's a beautiful thing. What I suggest, in my experience, I come from South India, because we have undergone like in late 70s, some religious riots. So now the people themselves have organized as neighborhood communities in one way to protect our cultural heritage sites, neighborhood communities, where you assemble as an Indian citizen and a human being, depriving of all your differences, your caste, your color, ethnicity, language, religion. Apart from that, you gather as first as Indian citizen and as a human being. Then among these, we try to bring forth that real harmony within that neighborhood communities. They serve as a clear network to protect these sites, the tangible sacred sites, of course. And we found it very valuable in the present era, because when some elements try to bring hatred or enmity between communities, these neighborhood communities or the social harmony clubs, they withstand the storm and they really help the local community to own it. And I could say that we are able to give plenty of success stories, because these harmony clubs or social harmony clubs or neighborhood communities, they play a very vital role in modern India. We are able to explain the necessity of the cultural sites, because that is the past history of our own forefathers and foremothers. So they should be protected so that we can pass it on to our generations to come. The history continues. So these neglected communities, when we often use the term here, neglected communities or marginalized communities, if we succeed to bring the people living in India, like 1.4 billion, if they are organized in neighborhoods, then I think we can permanently erase the term marginalized from the dictionary.
That's wonderful, and of course that also raises raises another issue. You flagged how do you imagine culture and how do you imagine cultural heritage? Your reference to India as one object of cultural heritage, in a way, reminds me of something which the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem raised at some point a few years ago at a conference in Cyprus, where he proposed that Jerusalem should be viewed as one holy site in order to stop the conversations about who owns what and the inner divisions in terms of where the dynamics lie. And this has certainly been very often on the agenda, but also reminds us of another aspect, that building culture, being stakeholders of culture, is also very important for the existential survival of religions and sometimes of political entities. The Baha'is were not on the miniature of Akbar I was talking about because they did not exist. But I could tell you that when they make headways and move to places like Palestine and the Ottoman Empire and India, they were not considered to be a mainstream community. And there is a very important connection between turning from a marginal faith or a new religious movement into a major world religion. And very often this is measured through the ways you create culture. I am pretty sure, and I could put my money on this, that the visibility of culture creation of the Baha'i faith, including the beautiful Lotus Temple in which we're hosted, is part of this process of becoming mainstream. And at that point, I wanted to bring my old friend Cole Durham into the conversation, because he is a member of a faith which was considered at some point marginal, and now it's increasingly becoming mainstream, up to the point that he almost ended up with the US almost ended up with a LDS president a few years ago. So, and Cole has obviously drafted pretty much every constitution in the post-communist world, and certainly legislation on registration of religion association. And I have somehow managed to muscle him into the religious cultural heritage conversations, and he's been enjoying it a lot and has contributed greatly to those conversations. But so I wanted to talk about how, from your perspective, having worked in different international contexts, but also from your own faith base, the culture creation, the culture generation, and I mean by this education, material culture, literature, is a process through which it makes religious associations wealthier, more prosperous, and more included into the wider framework of a particular political community in society. And what could we learn from the Mormon experience, and in terms of battling their way through being recognized and accepted as a community, and ultimately becoming a mainstream faith and another world religion in the 21st century?
Well, thank you, Peter. Let me try and respond to that question. And maybe a way to come at it is, this is sort of how I got originally recruited into this field in which Peter as one of the leading world experts, and which I am definitely not. But I remember going to a conference in Cyprus. I'm quite sure you were there.
We were there
Yeah,
together.
we were there together. He may have got me an invitation. I'm not sure how that happened. But you know, I listened to Peter talking about sacred sites for a long time, and the image that came to my mind was these old, very old churches, like like what you saw in Cyprus. And you saw different versions, and they were on opposite sides of the Turkish-Greek sort of divide in Cyprus. But as I sat through those discussions and how they were wrestling with and how sites were being attacked, how they were being eroded, and so forth, these were very ancient. Some of them go back, you know, hundreds of years. It suddenly occurred to me that these people were so exercised about this because this was really the center of their culture, the center of their cultural lives. And I realized that that I was coming at sacred sites from an opposite direction. That is, for me, I mean, the real issue and what happens and how religious culture, I think, gets formed is what Sadhvi the other day was talking about having access to the sacred. And we have different ways of relating to the sacred. And of course, what was striking to me was these very old sites. There was a kind of sacred resonance about them, and that was part of why people cared so much about them, because they had been a locus of the sacred for generations. I, on the other hand, was working in various parts of Europe, getting the right for religious organizations to be formed, to have a right to have a legal entity. People don't, this is not very dramatic. Nobody makes movies about registering legal entities, but without a legal entity, it's hard to rent property, acquire property. It's hard to have personnel that you can actually hire and pay a salary. It's hard to open a bank account. It's hard to do a lot of, it's hard to file a land use permit application. We'd call it zoning in the United States, as goes in different names by different countries. But these processes are how one starts out trying to make places sacred. And they are worship places. They're just sort of, I mean, very often if you're just starting out in a religious tradition, they're just a hall someplace that you've been able to rent, if you were able to get someone to rent to you. You'll appreciate this, Peter. We have all kinds of stories about people renting halls that they had to go and clean out the beer cans from the night before so they could have our non-beer drinking meetings. But it's these are very humble sites. They're not something would ever make it on the UN registry of sacred sites, and yet they're places where people experience the sacred. We had now. There's sort of another. So there's an early stage of the evolution of the culture when you're just maybe meeting in someone's home. There are all kinds of cases in the stands in Central Asia about people trying to have a prayer meeting in their home, and the police will break in and break it up because it's not a registered organization. So these are sort of the early forms of something being a sacred site. Interesting kind of intermediate point. in the United States, we have what are called landmarking statutes. Most municipalities have them, and I take it other places would have the equivalent. And not surprisingly, most of the places that are landmarked, I mean, 60%, 70%, are religious places. This is not surprising. They're often some of the oldest buildings in a community, but they're places where people have a lot of memories, marriages, funerals, things like that. So these become places of worship, and the way that people worship may differ, and that will affect the nature of the structures. It will affect other kinds of things that contribute to culture. Obviously, people start writing things down. Peter referred to some of the other sort of less architectural forms of the culture, but this comes with as people try to write down worship. I mean, I'm thinking these days about the fact that in our tradition, we're supposed to study the scriptures every day at home, but there are now podcasts advising you, you know, so the culture changes, but one of the things there's a very famous case in the United States about was when there was a challenge to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was passed in the early 90s, and the case was about a Catholic church in Texas near the border of Mexico, and it had supposedly neo-colonial architecture, which meant it was built in 1928, and people tried to make it look older. This was not a major historical landmark, but it had been landmarked, and the effect of landmarking was that what had happened is it was built for about 250 people, and about 2,000 Chicanos had moved in across the border and wanted to go to the Catholic Church, and there was not room, so they wanted to expand, but it had been landmarked, and so the landmarking meant you couldn't change the structure, and this meant that the building really wouldn't work for worship purposes. And it was interesting reading the Supreme Court briefs. You had a lot of architectural groups and land use planners saying, oh, we have to protect the this is like a museum, we have to protect that. But then there were the people who were trying to worship, and they were saying, but that museum value is interfering with our worship value of the building. And so this went to the Supreme Court, and actually the people challenging the landmark won in that case, or did they? Well, I always have. I can usually remember what the story was about, but the exact ending sometimes escapes me. But it was a case that in which the it's like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was upheld as applied to the federal government, but not opposed to the states, and so I can't remember whether zoning was federal or something. Anyway, that's technical. But that difference of interest is one of the areas where the tension about culture really gets felt, because it's a tension between the museum value of these sacred sites and the actual worship value, which is really what makes them sacred sites in the first place. Well, I probably said enough about that, but it's that evolution, and as a movement grows, you get more buildings, more structure. Some of them are wonderful buildings, some of them are cookie cutter buildings made by the real estate department, and so on.
But in a way also, what you remind me of is that this gradual shaping of the civic makeup through the effort of faith-based communities on the ground also is a reminder that religious buildings or natural sites are also an object of deep local contention. So a lot of the cases of the First Nations in Canada and the US are often trying to negotiate the interests of the First Nations to have access to their natural sacred sites with the interests of environmentalists, the interests of the public at large to be able to walk in these natural sites. And this is often negotiation very difficult to handle, and it's not surprising that it's often managed with the UN ADR systems. But it also raises a whole question of how this kind of navigation of different interests, which could be contested sites by different religious communities or contested sites by different stakeholders who view their use in a way which is very difficult to reconcile, also raises the question how this kind of tension, so also an opportunity to start a conversation nobody had even imagined that it should take place before the tension has arisen, but it also raises the question how any preventative tactics could help us have this conversation by reading the signs before the tension has already taken place. Do we need to have, does the state need to deal with an ethnic or religious violence, killing of people on the ground and burning down of religious sites, or would it rather read the signs before things go too far? And if you speak to policymakers, most of them are likely to say, well, it's probably the former, because ethnic clashes are never going to do any justice in terms of PR, but also in terms of dealing with violence on the ground. And at the same time, sometimes this type of violence is state-sponsored. In Bosnia, we still remember the cases where there was at least one village where all the people were murdered, and they were buried in the mass grave under. So the bodies were put in a mass grave and then covered with what was left from the mosque, which was blown up, and so symbolically burying the people, but also their heritage, and making a very contemptuous sign that they should never be there, and the memory of them should be erased. And we cannot ignore the possibility that when we talk about this complex protection of religious cultural heritage, we need to be aware that as we speak, there are a number of political communities across the globe, starting from the war in Ukraine, going through Nagorno-Karabakh and the tension between Armenia and Azerbaijan, going through Turkey, all the way through Israel, Iraq, and Syria, where there will be political communities which would have strategic interest to actually destroy cultural heritage, because they have strategic advantage to remove the memory of particular communities on the ground. So what kind of tools, what kind of possible directions we could give to policymakers to take if they're actually not interested in that? And so one of the arguments has been that one of the tools usually are associated with prevention. But so if you give policymakers opportunities to actually read the early signs, they would always take those opportunities. But there is increasingly another angle which we have been exploring in these meetings, which is linking religious cultural heritage with sustainable development and economic sustainability. People generally shy away from talking about religion in business and religion in economics, but a lot of religious sites are also very important economic hubs, which generate economies which deal with religious tourism and growth and sustainability of local communities. And I want to bring into the conversation my new friend Swapna, who is a very distinguished expert in the field of cultural heritage in India. And I was just going to explore this relationship between local and global, how some of the lessons which learn from India in terms of generating the energy of the local communities around religious sites and around religious culture as agents for change in terms of sustainable development.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for including me in this discussion. And I think I'd like to go back to what you were saying as to how these kind of conflicts begin, how they can be prevented. And what we have been seeing in India is that often the roots of these lie in politics of identity. So these are things, I mean, and of course, as we know, these are constructed and shifting parameters, you know. There are sites over which there was no conflict 50 years ago, and there is enormous conflict today. Or there you can see signs of conflict now beginning, and it's not big, and for sites that are really, really old in themselves. So why does this conflict arise? The conflict arises because of certain political movements that are taking place. What kind of what is the kind of narrative that is being pushed, etc. And often, I mean, and what we of course realize is that these are not a given. This is not a given. These can be read, that history can be read in so many different ways, and we have seen this. So therefore, and in India we often see this, how a history of a particular site, of a particular community, how that history is read, how the interaction between communities, how the history of that is read. It can make a lot of difference if you recognize the shifting patterns of how histories are being read and what repercussions they end up having in how a site is going to may become a point of conflict. Having said which, I strongly feel that it is often local communities who are the victims in this kind of politics that develops around sites, because often they are the ones who have a very immediate stake in that place. And I think if we shift our focus to the community which actually uses or lives around or has a stake in a very immediate stake in that, there is one stake that is a bigger stake. You have all sorts of identity tied up with that site. And the other is you live right at the base of this building. You see this the first thing you get up in the morning. You have a business which is affected by what happens to this site. I think we need to take into account the stakes that people living in that area have. And invariably we see, I mean, at least from the Indian experience, I can say that when you look at communities which live around religious sites, they are invariably quite, they show a surprising amount of diversity, cultural diversity as well. And because they have a stake in peace, because it affects their daily lives in such an important way, if we involve them in seeing how these sites become relevant for local development. And in India, there is a huge amount of untapped resource in this as to how, and many of our, some of the older sites definitely are religious sites, are surrounded by communities and historic settlements and historic cities and things which are very old, have a lot of other kinds of heritage. For instance, whether it's an old town, lovely old buildings, they have a lot of potential for development, for again sustainable development, because heritage is sustainable by its in many ways. So if these are seen, these historic places are seen as ways in which local communities can have a sustainable livelihood, and they are involved in this, I think that is the way we need to go forward. Because as it's, of course, we know that conflict doesn't benefit anybody in this way.
But in terms of direct action, like environmental projects, are the religious cultural heritage sites the real problem or the real solution? I mean, I just came back from Vrindavan, which is one of the major centers focused on the devotion of Krishna, and it's a major pilgrim's route. But in terms of an urban dynamics, it's an absolute disaster. It's heavy pollution, heavy traffic, noise, the place is falling apart, the ashrams and temples mushrooming everywhere. Some are absolutely horrendous in terms of aesthetics, and 200-meter tall Disney-style statues. And everybody agrees that the place is growing in a very unsustainable way. And it seems that gradually the faith-based communities are trying to address issues of environmental protection, reforestation, and trying to go back to in a more sustainable fashion. But how realistic is that? Do you get the sense that this kind of faith-based actors are really part of the solution, or are they more of a part of the problem?
Again, I think what we need to look at is, are we looking at, when we say faith-based, again, we are looking at a very different, and definitely the Indian, in the Indian context, who are the representatives of that religious group which claims ownership of a particular site? Who are they? Who are the custodians? Very often these things are also there's a lot of, often, as I again said, the community which is immediately around it is often not consulted. And that needs to be really looked at, because and particularly in religions which don't have that very clear structures of control, and these things will definitely need to be looked at. And of course, I feel that a religious site is a religious site, but it is cultural beyond religion also. Of course, the religious aspect is important.
So let me just ask a question, because on the one hand, what I'm hearing you say is the way some of these conflicts should be solved is by looking to the local surrounding community. And that's typically how most land use things are approached. That is, and it's frankly one of the things that makes land use issues very local, because there's always local politics and local people who can call the small little board that's making decisions. But I'm conscious, and I'm seeing a couple of Indonesians here. I'm not going to get the law exactly right, but I know that there's one of the laws in place in Indonesia is you have to have, there's a requirement that you you consult the people around a proposed site of a place of worship. And I can't remember if it's, I can't remember the exact dimensions, but the difficulty is if you're a small religious group, you will never, first of all, you will never have very many people in that location, and you're probably looking for a place that will serve a community that's spread out all over the city. So if you look at the local group, they will almost always exclude the particular group. So, and then, so that's the micro level. And of course, the Ayodhya case, you had people around, and I mean, it was sort of unclear who was local and who wasn't, but so there are some questions about how much local control you should give those situations.
Oh yes, I think you have quite a good point there. I mean, the kind of points that I'm looking at are, I'm approaching this from a very different position here in, you know, what is local to us, you know, and how those kind of things tend to work. And I'm thinking more in terms of how some of these things come to be decided at levels that are much higher than the local, and without consulting people who are in a particular area. And of course, that, and again, as I said, these are problems that keep shifting as well.
And
The problem itself keeps shifting because the situation changes.
Indeed, and from our perspective, the context, the unique context of a place like India, and India is not exception to that, is beyond comparison to with some of the cases which we have studied before. So, for example, in an Indian context, the whole idea of a country of such scale to have a top-down approach to all those issues is completely unsustainable. Vrindavan has about 1,000 temples. I just came back from Jaipur and went to the Amber Fort, and there is a small town just before the Amber Fort which had a tiny number of 400 temples. And if you have this kind of scale, which just is translated across the whole the Indian subcontinent, things are in unimaginable scale, and you cannot possibly even consider that there could be a policy which could navigate state-driven approaches to those things. There may be more holistic policies which could see the benefits of state actors and the protection of their religious freedom, the protection of their right to exist, culture, determination, which are all driven by international commitments to which India and most of other states around the world are parties. And this would be just a very broad guidelines to create inclusive societies. And then in this context, you could only have a very general statements how those faith-based communities and their visual manifestation in terms of their material culture could be very important agents for change in multiple ways, and could accelerate some of the sustainable development goals as we know them. But the very thought that the state could do something about this is going to be extremely alien. In a similar way, in a tiny dwarf of a country like Israel, in terms of territory, by comparison, religious communities are generally extremely hostile to the idea that the state should fix those problems. And this is why all the issues of religious property there are approached through the perspective of private property, because the religious associations absolutely hate the idea that their cultural heritage, because the moment someone says cultural heritage, they expect that the state will step in and exercise its state duties and protect them the way they don't want to be protected. And this is time perhaps to bring my friend and colleague Peter Francois into the conversation. Peter, you're a data person. You look into historical trends and how historical trends translate into emerging patterns in terms of social cohesion, social transformation, and social and toleration. I mean, we're obviously trying to unpack something which is clearly very context specific and very difficult to describe in common terms which work in the same way in every country. But do you see a way of turning this around through data analysis and data approach and actually start getting some common patterns which are comparative but also cater for the context, but also bring overarching themes, overarching patterns, and generate families of approaches to the way we could think about and imagine religious cultural heritage and religious sites?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for this question as well. The answer to that is yes. I do see a way forward to that, but obviously I also need to reflect a bit or manage the expectations of people on it. It's just basically data science and looking at patterns can offer one additional tool to help reducing violence against religious heritage, but also not more than that. So it's definitely not the tool, it's definitely not a very technocratic solution that I stand for. But as you say, I do believe between, in a way, data science and the policy world, strong links and relevant, impactful links can be built. And also want to pick up a little bit in my answer to a point made by one of the speakers before, that she said, well, actually, these sites of conflict are definitely never a given, but they are constructed, and even if you go back 20, 30 years ago, you would have seen a different geography, and probably, most likely, in 20, 30 years' time, you will see again a different geography. So if I'm thinking through this, what I'm interested in is saying, like, fine, you do see violence against religious heritage sites, but I'm asking then always the question as a data person more, how representative is this one example? For example, how representative is Ayodhya for India today, right? That could be, the answer could be it's extremely representative. This sums up the larger field. It could also be that, well, hang on, this is one dimension that we see, but we also see a lot of coexistence and absolutely no violence. But how do you measure that, right? That opens up questions. Do we focus on, let's say, the high-level violence, breaking down a building, burning it, or do we look at more a low-level violence of, let's say, graffiti, but repeated in nature and so on and so forth? And to me, very important is, how does that relate to religious tolerance more generally, right? What I like about studying religious heritage is that it's more measurable than many other dimensions of religious tolerance, and also in the past. So in my view, having some kind of metric, a diagnostic tool of being able to place religious violence against religious heritage on a scale, and we can debate that scale endlessly, helps you identifying, saying, like, where are we in our country, in our time, right? So if I'm allowed to make a step back, so I'm an evolutionary anthropologist and I do world history in a way, so it's my bread and butter in a way to track change over longer timescales. So one of the projects that I founded asks 2,000 questions for every year, the same questions for every geographic point in the world. And that gives obviously a good comprehensive data set from which you can start seeing trends, analyzing them, and so on. So some of these questions are focusing on the usual suspects. How wealthy was a country? How stable was it? Can you measure the amount of warfare? Can you measure the amount of trade, and so on? So fine. But I think a lot of the really interesting action lies actually in the field of culture and in religion. So one specific area that I've been focusing on the last 3-4 years is how can we measure through world history in the way I described religious tolerance and religious freedom, right? So for that, in consultation with sociologists and so on, I have designed over 30 very specific questions that I'm asking for as many historical polities as I can, at the moment over 600, for every year, and for also localized within the countries. Now, some of these questions are pertaining to religious sites, because these allow you to push them back in time relatively easily. Because you have archaeological remains. If you, for example, say, were there any rules about the circulation of religious texts, which is also a question we're asking. Now, good luck in pushing that forward the further you go in time. You know, then you have a very different answer depending on the climate conditions, are texts surviving, etc., etc. Once archaeological remains and religious heritage seems to work relatively well. So what this allows us to do is, in a way, putting together a religious tolerance index over time and correlate that and see how it interacts with the stability of a society, the peacefulness, the wealth of a society, and map that on the life cycle of societies, map that on the life cycle of civil war and so on. And basically figuring out when does religious tolerance help driving development, and how can those lessons learned, is there one universal pattern, are there a few, and how can we grapple with those? How can these lessons be learned, fed back into the policy world? So this is very much what my project is trying to do, and we have made great progress on that. And we are using, in a way, the whole measuring violence against religious heritage sites almost as a canary in the coal mine, because it works as a kind of visible metric and saying, like, hang on, from what point in time do we need to start being worried? The moment we see one little instance of violence, that could be a lone action of an individual one, at what point in time do we need to be extra vigilant and say, this is becoming dangerous? And it's not, obviously, Ayodhya was too late, right? So it is about unpacking that time dimension and using it as a diagnostic tool to reduce this. So this is one way of influencing the policy world, of offering a better understanding, but I do want to repeat in a way that it's combining these kinds of global and very data-centric tools together with the local knowledge often known by either activists, practitioners, scholars, historians and so on, which is where the real action is and the real promise.
Wonderful, thank you. And of course that is a reminder that part of the purposes of these meetings are to develop a reflective thinking, but also some concrete proposals and recommendations for the G20 governments, because after all, we could share this friendship and ideas and have conversations forever, and those ideas could lead to great publications, to even more ideas, but ultimately we need to think about what do we want to tell the G20 governments. And if we tell them that we could, if they take seriously religious cultural heritage, this is going to be very important for them to develop reading of early warnings that trouble is about to happen. But maybe governments don't necessarily want to have that. Maybe some governments do want the trouble to happen anyway. There are so many cases where there is repeated violence around the same religious sites, which is almost predictable to happen around 2 or 3 religious holidays, and still doesn't make any difference, even if there are multiple political communities which meet in advance and strategize how to make sure that there is no violence. And yet, it is very difficult to prevent it. But early warning is certainly one of those things which governments would like in principle. that if we are able to persuade them that religious cultural heritage is that sort of measure which helps you to predict how religion makes a difference in terms of shaping policies, and you could read what happens around religious sites as early warning of something big that's about to happen and it is to be prevented, that's one thing. Another aspect I wanted to raise with the speakers, and what do they think about this, to talk more about the kind of things which we want to engage with, to make governments more responsible to protect tolerance, plural societies, multicultural societies, and their material cultures, in cases where they actually don't want to do so. So what do you think is going to work from your perspective? Do you think that linking, for example, protection of cultural heritage with investment agreements is a way forward? I remember not a very long time ago a particular American citizen being imprisoned for quite a long time in a country I'm not going to mention, and the State Department was completely unable to do anything about this. And a certain international financial institution managed to convey very informally a message to this certain country that if what must happen doesn't happen, they're not going to receive their next tranche of their international loan, and the American citizen was released very quickly. So clearly connecting some of those commitments which link culture with violence with investment is a way to make governments to listen. And the G20 countries are in perhaps the best possible position to do these kind of things. But do you think that this kind of carrot and stick approach is likely to work in places like South Asia or in other conflict zones you're familiar with? Swapna?
One would like, sorry. Yes, one would like to think so, and definitely that's many of these things are about who are the people involved. Who, a United States citizen, for instance, who's at, lot of weight can be thrown behind a United States citizen who's in trouble, and but yes, of course, I mean these kind of things can work, but contexts are very fluid. But given all those ifs and buts, yes, yeah, I think so.
So economic pressure certainly linking.
Oh, yes.
Linking protection of cultural heritage with economic pressure,
yes,
and a commitment to sustainable development. Rajan, do you think that's going to work from in your line of work, or do you think that just naming and shaming on grounds of violation of human rights and religious freedom is likely to have great traction?
Well, every religion started at a particular point of time in the history to bring more peace in the world, to build up the community, different parts of the world, of course, in Arabia, in India, wherever it was started. So the basic purpose was to create one humanity, every religion, because the core belief is love thy neighbor. And on that basis, they have developed these sacred sites, mosques, temple, churches, or anything, whatever we call the so-called sacred places, for the community to come together and to experience the fraternal feeling. So almost every religion agree in that basic principles. So now, maybe we don't know about 200, 300 years back what took place, but now most of the countries on the earth are democratic. So as a democratic country, it is a prime motive of the state, if it is a welfare state, of course, to bring peace in the community and to develop the people. in that particular point, if they fail, if the failure is from the side of the government, then, as you have suggested, then the other countries can really involve. If it is between the communities, then we have laws, local laws, national laws, international conventions. They have to try to bring a real solution when they have an early warning of some sort of thing is brewing up and which may upset the democratic principles in the country. Then the government has to take real steps to settle it amicably. Because when we say that it is a cultural heritage, it is not only belonging to a particular community. Now it has become a part of the global community. It's a human race. It won't be human. So, first of all, if it is between smaller communities, then they could be settled within the country. But purposefully, to gain political power or some other thing, if the government itself fails and they are main source for these conflicts, for the riots, for the misunderstandings, for the hatred, then I think in order to retrieve the democratic principles, to keep the country, to sustain the country as a democratic republic, not only India I say, but like any other democratic countries, then I think probably what you have suggested will be a better option, and it is only one among many options, I would suggest.
But I mean, the question really is, and I think I completely take both of your responses at heart, but the question is, we're living in a unique situation of resurgence of pretty conservative right-wing politics, which I describe in one of my publications as religious exceptionalism, where religion is used as a packaging of what multiple countries wish to exercise as a form of American exceptionalism, except without any regard for democratic institutions, independent judiciary, and human rights respect. And if this is an emerging pattern, and this is seen as a success story, that if you could run the most unacceptable and outrageous political platforms, which become acceptable as soon as they're packaged as religious perspectives, it becomes an object of concern, because if this is an emerging pattern, that means that a lot of those governments couldn't give a hoot about international law or human rights. And increasingly, we see this as a recurring pattern, that commitment to international obligations is no longer something they care very much about. Yes, it gives them bad publicity, but ultimately it doesn't bite. And Cole, of course, is very experienced in working in this context in the States and internationally. I mean, what is your take? Do you think that if one is to pressurize a particular government to develop good practices in relation to religious cultural heritage, should this be done in the way it's done by the State Department, countries of particular concern, or in the way it's named and shamed by the US Commission? Or do you think that's really the kind of hidden economic sanctions, like tweaking with investment agreements, tweaking with international loans and financial commitments, is likely to fly much higher than just reminding a particular government that they have violated their commitments to international law? Because in most cases this doesn't seem to go very far.
This will be sort of an indirect reply, but on the one hand, I believe that there are some basic principles of respect for religious communities that ought to be that ought to be sort of the baseline principles. Now, I remember in the early 90s being invited to meet with some people in Hungary, and one of my friends asked me, he said, they're having a problem about religious property disputes. Do you think you could talk to them? And I said, oh, this is great, because I do know these religious property dispute cases in the United States, and they're actually very interesting, and there are tons of them because there are a lot of Protestant groups that have sued each other and so on, so there are a lot of cases. And I got into the situation, and I realized what had happened in Hungary was that if you took a particular piece of property, a particular piece of religious property, it had been owned by someone in the 1930s, then another government came along and it was owned by, it was transferred to some other religious group, and then then it was sort of the Nazi period, and then there was the communist takeover in the late 40s, and the property again got transferred, and then so the property disputes were now who should own the property. and I realized that and there were something like 5 or 6 legitimate claimants along the way. And what popped into my mind is this is a bankruptcy situation. You ought to just say everyone has a claim and use totally different rules, because the rules that I had come into the discussion intending to apply were sort of rules for the normal situation where basic principles of religious freedom apply that have been settled, and that's the normal situation. But what we were dealing with was transitional justice and trying to work things out. But what I realized is that typically from a religious point of view, most of the religious communities, or a lot of them, are older than the relevant states, and they have histories that go back further, and so from their perspective, what's going on in a particular point of time in a modern nation state is really part of a piece of transitional justice as that kind of state has emerged. So it makes it very difficult to actually answer the question. My own sense is that it's sort of trying to solve the issues from an international perspective is probably not optimal. On the other hand, if you look back through history, what really starts happening is either you have a local political issue, or you have a kind of international issue of some sovereign protecting its citizens who are having trouble in the other place. And what we somehow need to find some set of principles that would work across these very different kind of historical contexts. Now it may come back to who are the stakeholders and trying to find a reasonable way to think about the stakeholders, but it's not just the local stakeholders, it's historical stakeholders, it's a lot of other people, and that's what makes these things so complicated, and that's what makes Ayodhya or the Temple Mount, because you've got millennia of history concentrated on a place.
And this would also bring us to another angle of approaching the religious cultural heritage and linking it with education. And often religious cultural heritage is the hub, the educational hub, which changes perspectives about multiple identities, which sometimes coexist, and very often aggravates the tensions, but very often also creates opportunities for learning and development of understanding that communities which seemingly cannot coexist, in fact, have coexisted for centuries, and there isn't any particular reason why they started killing each other overnight. And I mean, if one reads, for example, the history of the Hebron riots, it was literally when everything began. It was the neighbors with whom the local Jews had tea. It was those who committed the executions, perhaps immediately after tea or later this afternoon. And this kind of triggers are extremely difficult to understand, and very often in this sort of context, long-termist education is clearly a very important factor to change hearts and minds and make people understand how a particular cultural object has this more holistic understanding, which creates like collective ownership rather than an ownership of a particular stakeholder and particular community. And this is certainly an untapped opportunity which is now being approached by this whole new trend, which was accelerated through COVID, and it was the accelerated digitalization of the way which we learn and approach things. Nobody talked about digital pilgrimages until COVID, and COVID made this possible. And it made it possible for people who could never even imagine to visit places which are gender segregated or inaccessible for some other reasons. But also it was an opportunity to imagine contested religious sites in a way people have not imagined them before, to imagine them both as Al-Aqsa Mosque, as well as the Temple Mount, as well as the Crusaders churches which existed on the Al-Aqsa compound during the Crusades. And this began to emerge as ways of thinking in a more holistic ways of things which are not visibly necessarily easy to imagine in such a holistic way. And Peter has been doing a lot of work on in digital humanities. Is any of this coming into your radar, or is it too early to actually predict in what way digital humanities, digital holy sites, digital religious tourism are a way forward in the way of in terms of changing hearts and minds about how we imagine religious cultural heritage, particularly in contexts where it is very contested and very contentious?
Well, a conclusive answer I definitely can't offer, right? But I'm glad you raised this issue, because in a way I felt the previous question to me doesn't hold too much traction. So yes, we can withhold aid and trade agreements and so on, but to me that seems like last resort and does not come across as a proven way to long-lasting success. Also, it means it's an outsider who decides what is worth conserving, what is not, and what should be the correct way of engaging with the religious site. So I felt, yes, can they be part of an answer? Maybe in a minor way, but much, much more important is how you link sites to local ownership and, as you say, educate and so on. That seems to me like a much better bet in long-term reduction of violence against religious sites. Now, whether you now say, well, we'll do it through the immersive digital technology, I think you touched upon two dimensions. One, I believe more in than the other, for the purpose of reduction of cultural heritage destruction. So, yes, it allows different groups to have different access points to the same heritage. So you would assume that could be helpful. But at the same time, again, it brings in, you run the risk, you cut out the local element again, and you bring in, you almost export outside views to it and say, well, my right to engage with the site from 1,000 kilometers away is equally valid, and so on. So I think it will be a two-edged sword, really. On the one hand, it might work as an amplifier to bring in even more diverse viewpoints and a kind of policing and pushing of ideological agendas. On the other hand, of course, it does allow you novel and new ways to interact with it. So I think the little bit of work that I have seen is not presented as the golden bullet, but more the same set of tensions that you see in an analog interaction with the religious site will be replicated in a digital way, and you will have, if you want, there will be plenty of potential for conflict. If you want, there will be plenty of potential for harmony.
But of course, and I'm very grateful for this response, because it also raises the question, raises the point that challenges and opportunities are just not one-dimensional, and in a way, our role as experts is not to just give very easy answers, but to give directions to the multiple tools which are out there. Very often, the tools relating to religious sites and religious cultural heritage are so scattered so broadly in the corpus of international law that even international lawyers cannot work it out how they work. And any emerging soft law approaches, and there have been some great good practices in this respect, including the United Nations Alliance of Civilization toolkit for protection of religious sites, some of the guidelines promoted by the Knights of Malta for protection of religious sites in the Mediterranean, and the Universal Code for the Protection of Holy Sites. And the general moral of the story has been that there appears to be a lot more taste and appetite for soft law tools, which are quite palatable and manageable for policymakers, rather than new treaties, new elaborate rules, which are likely to complicate things more rather than simplifying them. And ultimately, guidelines which give opportunities for policymakers to imagine things the way they haven't imagined them before. The digital dimension, relating religion with economics, relating religion with security, relating culture with the environment, and so on and so forth, and how this could translate into a more obvious policy commitments policymakers would not necessarily recognize in relation to religious sites. And by doing this, we're not claiming that we have all the answers, but we're certainly pushing things in a direction to gradually start emerging with some specific pointers which nudge the G20 governments, but also beyond the G20 governments, how commitments to these policies, even through soft law commitments, are likely to make their policies in other areas more interesting that they may have been yesterday, and how they could connect in a more comprehensive way the understanding of why the Sustainable Development Goals are the way they are and not different, and how some focal points like environment, culture, etc., would make all the other Sustainable Development Goals to actually work in a more coherent way. Ko is trying to grab my microphone, which probably suggests that he has something more to say.
as I sit here listening, one of the things that this all suggests is that we're dealing with sort of very complex problems that we've been wrestling with for probably millennia. Now, what one would like to have is a few simple principles that could say, okay, there's a dispute about how we use this particular site, and these are the principles that we're going to use to resolve it. But then we start working at it, and we start finding that there are a lot more sort of insights or angles for looking at the problem. You start wanting, on the one hand, you want to take into account local perspectives, but then you realize that there are some people who are not local who may have an interest, and you don't want to have global power politics used as the solution, but you'd like to have a kind of principled solution that one hopes would align with basic universal principles of religious freedom and respect for people's religious views, but will also take other things into account. And then you start throwing in soft law, and and I'm just struck by the fact that, in a way, what we want to have is a way of bringing the viewpoints of as many people as possible into account, and having some way of sorting them out. And we have some sense that as human beings, if we honestly take other viewpoints into account, we will come to a better solution than if we just pursued any particular interests. But we don't have an assurance that there's a simple set of principles that will unlock everything. Yeah.
Indeed, and the more we think about this, the more we tend to come to the conclusion that any directions, emerging new directions, would look more like a medieval gloss rather than a short declaration. Because in the same way the Europeans began to think legally through once short text covered with extended glosses which were expanded by the jurists of every generation and essentially shaped the European legal culture, considering the complexities, the global complexities of the problems on the ground in relation to religious cultural heritage, we could only come to the conclusion that our thinking has to be as open-minded as the one of the glossators, that there are not going to be three simple principles. There are going to be multiple directions and multiple perspectives which, through the train of thought which is going in one direction, are likely to emerge, to lead to the emergence of more consolidated good practices, rather than something somebody somewhere going to agree on and is going to work in every specific context. This conversation could continue forever, particularly considering how exciting those speakers are, but everything has to come to an end, including this panel. Thank you very much for our guests, and thank you for the speakers for this inspiring conversation. Watch the space. Those conversations, as I said, are open-ended. They feature on our website and media channels. And those of you who are interested in religious cultural heritage, you just have to wire into the website of EVE 20, which will lead you to some of the other recorded sessions or published texts which continue the conversation. Thank you for being with us, and look forward to seeing you at our future meetings. Bye.